hearts. May they be acceptable to you. May they bring you great joy, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So I think one of the problems facing America today, and I don't think it's actually probably just us, is political anger. And that's about as political as I'll get today, so don't worry. But what can we do as Christians in our various communities? That's really what I want to touch on. Contribute to society which is bitterly divided on so many things, and you know them. Some scholars and community leaders worry that we are so deeply divided that violence may become more of a common response to conflict really than nonviolent protests or civil disobedience or traditional forms of mediation and negotiation. However, this can be, I think, a time of great opportunity for the Christian church, for us to witness, but perhaps not in the way that we might traditionally think. Our greatest witness may not be taking one position or another. Like the world around us, the Christian church is divided on so many of the same issues. And just to name a few, I'm not saying you believe one way or another. Abortion, orientations, race, gun violence, constitutional issues. These are just a few that we're all aware of. But I do not think there will be an easy or immediate answers to any of these things. But I do believe that in the midst of such difficulties, there's contributions we can make. As the Apostle Paul says in Corinthians, I'll remind you, we can show a more excellent way to live. We can demonstrate how to deal with differences while maintaining a sense of community. And I think that's where the beauty comes in. We can engage in a deeply felt conflict without destroying one another. The Apostle Paul continues to explain the more excellent way. As though addressing charismatic Christians, he says, if I speak in human or angelic tongues, if I am without love, I'm sounding a gong or a clanging cymbal. As though addressing evangelical Christians, I may have the gift of prophecy and know every hidden truth. I may have faith strong enough to move mountains, but if I have no love, I am nothing. And then social gospel activist Christians says, I dole out all possess or even give my body to be burnt, but if I have no love, I am none the better. In a word, there are three things that last forever. And I think those are faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of them, as we heard, what is that? Love. And I believe that is a more excellent way to love. It's not necessarily that kind of warm, fuzzy feeling, but a godly respect. A respect born out of understanding that others in a community are people who are loved and received by God, even though we may freely disagree with them, and that's okay, as long as there's a respect and a love. For example, in what we read today in the 9th chapter of John, Jesus and his disciples encounter a man who is blind. And the disciples, drawing upon the popular theology of what time asked, who sinned that this man was born blind? He or his parents? And Jesus, if we might remember, Jesus responds, his blindness is an opportunity for God to be glorified. And like most ancient people, the disciples did not understand dreaded conditions such as blindness, especially when such conditions really happened at birth. Their theology considered blindness and other things to be caused by the sin But Jesus' reply to the disciples seems to say, when the cause is not clear, what can we do is move beyond blame and minister in healing. This will always glorify God. So how many of us have claimed God's judgment upon causing the unwillingness to minister to people suffering with whatever you call it, or struggling or victim of a situation? My concern when we do that, God is not glorified and blamers need to blame. Love was absent. And love is what draws people to God. And when we live on the premise of love, it has a way of soothing and smoothing the rough edges of our faith to fit even more gracefully into God's hands, where we can be used for God's greater glory. So another example we might consider has to do with cultural and political issues. Christians, like the general public, are deeply divided on so many things. I don't need to tell you that, you already know that. Moral and political things. But none of these issues facing our contemporary church could have been more sensitive and divisive than the issue of whether Gentile Christians had to be circumcised and follow the Jewish law. Remember that the first Christians like Jesus were Jews, and up until this point in the church history, Christianity was seen as a Jewish sect, or in some circles, a cult. So as Paul and others began preaching in Gentile communities, more and more Gentiles were believing in this gospel, but these new Gentile converts did not see the need as much over time to adhere to Jewish customs and laws. So concerned leaders from the older Christian communities came to these Gentile converts and taught that they could not be Christians if they did not observe the Jewish law and be circumcised. Now that the Christian church is predominantly a Gentile church, this may seem like a trivial matter to us. Perhaps none of us care about that, but that was a huge thing in their time. But it was bitterly divisive, and it gave rise to strong political feelings about who was a traditionalist and who was a liberal, who was orthodox, who was a heretic in some eyes. And today it would be like suggesting that one could be Christian without requiring baptism, which I've heard these in some circles. There's lots of debate still in certain communities. Or perhaps even more in our certain context, it would be heretical in some circles if someone would receive communion as they're coming to faith but has not yet received communion. I've heard these things in my growing up. But baptism was a strong controversy like us, with the traditional side led by St. Peter and St. James, and the other side led by St. Paul and St. Barnabas. But what impresses me most in the scriptural accounts in Acts is that opponents are referred to as believers. Even though they were painfully at odds, there was an assumption that the people with oppressing views could be believers. And as it is today, the issues and debates in the early church were many. But what seems to be clear, as one reads the New Testament, is that the church's most important witness is not whether it's pro or con, but that it is able to sustain itself as a community in times of significant differences, severe polarization. And I think that's a very interesting point. Of course, it has not always been true of the church. We're not exactly very good at uniting. But at times we fought wars and burned people at stakes and divided. But when commitment to love has been true, I do feel the church has really tried its best most of the time, and God has been glorified. So on the other hand, when our society is at its best, it is often striving to be tolerant. How do we hear, "You must be more tolerant"? This may be the most unredeemed word that we can hope for. But I find that toleration can often be nothing more than a managed hostility. The polarization, the bitterness, and the anger we see in our world have not only to do with more serious issues that we face, but that we feel we can no longer manage our hostility toward those who have differing views. However, the Christian faith calls us to this higher, more excellent way than just toleration. It calls us to hospitality, and in Greek, xenophilia, meaning fraternal respect for one who is different. Respect takes on this position. We may differ on this one issue, but I acknowledge that you are a person of faith too, a Christian, an errant one perhaps, but a Christian nonetheless. And a little story. I'm the youngest of two daughters. My sister's just 3 years older. And when I was growing up, we had all the fights like siblings do. You know how that happens. And she wanted to tell me what to do and to be in charge, but I completely did the utter opposite because I didn't want to be bossed around. And I'm sure you all might have similar stories. So sometimes our disagreements would get so intense that we would need an intervener. And I grew up with both parents, fortunately, and I remember my mom would reply when we said something like, "She took my doll," or "She was a liar," or "Dad, she broke the rules." Often we were told to try and resolve it ourselves. And it was eventually clear, often, that what was most important to our parents is that we apologized, but also that we behaved in such a way that demonstrated really our bond as family and being brought up as disciples of Christ. And this was even more important to that, I think, than really a resolution, because you can agree to disagree. And I think this is what God says to the church. I know you have your differences, but you must struggle to resolve them as brothers and sisters, or at least do your best. Aim for that. This is what I expect of you because you are all my children. You are all my children. And Jesus said it this way in the Gospel of John in chapter 13. "By this, everyone will know you are my disciples if you have love for one another." If you have love for one another. Love, or having a godly respect for one another, it doesn't suggest that we ignore our differences. Respecting one another includes acknowledging our sincerely held differences. Love means committing ourselves to this messy or frustrating, exhausting work of resolution without destroying one's community. Our convictions are certainly important, especially convictions of faith. A community which lacks convictions, even differing convictions, I think lacks integrity. But conviction without respect for community is simply blind passion and easily becomes abusive or destructive. So the answers to deeply complex matters are never political resolve, but in the hard, prayerful work of consensus building among faithful people. In a community, the goal is never simply political victory, but the preservation of Christian mission and witness. At least I hope that's what it is. But what a crucial witness we can be to the world to testify that there is a more excellent way to deal with the issues that divide us, whether it's here or out there, wherever, whatever your circles of community are. This is hard work, and we will make some mistakes. We will have failures in the process. But I believe that God is more pleased by the witness we make in struggling to love and respect one another in the battles we wage against these political victories. I really think there's a more excellent way, and Christians we are called to live in. And for example, of how we deal with our differences can be really vital in our contribution to a polarized society. May all this be so. In the name of the triune God. Amen. Amen. Let us pray. Gracious God, I hope that we heard you this morning. May we grapple with what you speak to us as we grapple with being a community, withholding our convictions, withholding our differences. May we love and understand more and more what that means from you and not what we think it means. May we strive for community each and every day. Amen.